Erev Tov, everybody. Great to be together again as we are in the week of Parashat Vayera, sort of flying through early biblical history and now slowing down into the life of Avraham Avinu last week and now this week. There are a bunch of um, comments of Rav Bazak on this parsha. We're going to zero in on a few of them. Skipped over the first two. The first one in which he attempts to sort out who exactly are the people who come to greet Abraham and what's their relationship with God and how do those overlap and how does that resolve some of the questions about how many there are at different stages in the story. And then his second comment is about Sarah's laughter and the distinction between hers and Abraham's. Abraham seems to be regarded as not problematic, but Sarah's is criticized, and he attempts to make a differentiation between Abraham's laughter, which is bilibo, and is able to bring some good proof texts that that's kind of a more thoughtful, wondrous kind of posture, and that Sarah's is bikir ba, and about that he doesn't have any proof text. He only notices that that's an unusual language. So he has more compelling argument about Abraham's than about why Sarah's should be problematic. Those were the first two. We're going to pick up with the third essay, and I'll share my screen. Okay. Called Training for Righteousness. The hospitality of Abraham and Lot are described in similar terms. Again, we were already very familiar with this maybe primary approach to Pshat of Rav Bazak's, which is to notice the parallel or the similarity between one passage or narrative and another, and then highlight the differences as a way of explaining one or the other, or both. The hospitality of Abraham and Lot are described in similar terms. As soon as Abraham saw potential guests, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. This is the beginning of our parashah. And bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Bathe your feet and recline under the tree, that you may refresh yourselves, then go on." That's the beginning of Perek Yud Chet, that first story in our parashah. Lot, too, begs guests to stay. When Lot saw them, he rose to greet them, and bowing low with his face to the ground, he said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house to spend the night and bathe your feet. Then you may be on your way early." He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So this is the beginning of chapter 19. So these two juxtaposed stories and juxtaposed prakim are very, very similar. There are a few minor differences, but the major one is in the condition of the host. Abraham is at home, secure as master of his household, meaning both Abraham and Lot are masters of their households, but Abraham's position is secure as master of his household. Lot, on the other hand, lives in Sodom. He risks his life and his family's lives to protect his guests, meaning he's the master of his household, but he's not in a secure position as master of his household because he's up against the threat of the outsiders and the neighbors who want to harm his guests. Immediately after welcoming their guests, both Abraham and Lot hear the news that Sodom is to be destroyed. Both work to minimize the destruction. Abraham, in a famous dialogue with God, bargains over the number of righteous people it would take for Sodom to be saved. It ends with God agreeing not to destroy the city if 10 good people can be found within it. "I will not destroy," says God, "for the sake of the 10. Lo ashchit ba'avor ha'asara." Abraham does not ask for the city to be saved on account of fewer than 10, as apparently he believes that the request would not be granted, right? So Rav Bazak wants to, even though this isn't the focus of his essay, he still wants to understand how far does one go to plead for the saving of Sodom. And there's an implicit question, why does Abraham stop at 10? And he just, cites, parenthetically mentions Rashi and cites this explanation that Abraham just thought, that that kind of a plea wouldn't be answered. He went as far as he thought God would go. Where Abraham fails, Lot succeeds. Okay, it's sort of surprising to read at first. Lot hesitates. He cannot bear to leave his home, his daughters and sons-in-law, right? Again, remember the parallel here that he's set up is each of them, after their guests arrive, are notified that Sodom is going to be destroyed, and each of them in some way tries to save the city. Abram, as in, is outside the city, tries to save it by convincing God not to destroy it. Lot has a different approach. Lot hesitates. He cannot bear to leave his home, his daughters and sons-in-law. The angels extricate him and command him to run for the hills. Lot is both physically and emotionally unable to go that far, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. He asks for another favor. Look, that town there is near enough to flee to. It is such a little place. Let me flee there. It is such a little place, and let my life be saved. We're going to look at this inside at the end of the essay. Lot understands that his fate is tied up with where he lives. That is why he points to a town that is small. Perhaps that can be saved. And so his wish is granted. Very well, I will grant you this favor too, and I will not annihilate the town of which you have spoken. They are saved, they, the residents of that town, despite the fact that the people of Tsoar are not substantially different from those of Sodom. We read later that Lot leaves the town, for he was afraid to dwell in Tsoar. I think he understands that to mean that the people there were as, evil and sinful as the people of Sodom, and so Lot feared for his life or welfare staying there, so he ultimately left, but somehow managed to save the city. How did Lot manage to save a town in the environs of Sodom when his righteous uncle could not? The answer is simple. Abraham asked for the towns to be saved on the basis of law and justice. Is it possible, he asks God, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty? He approaches the issue as an outsider. Lot, however, who practices his uncle's gracious hospitality even in Sodom, has earned a special merit. Through this merit, he saves a whole town, even if it does not have 10 or any righteous inhabitants. Lot was certainly a complex character, as the birth of his grandsons Ammon and Moab will demonstrate. Still, his faithfulness to the ways of Abraham in the hostile environment of Sodom gave him the power to save an entire community, precisely because he lived among them. So for me, reading this little essay kind of made me pay attention to this part of the Parsha, which I kind of always glossed over. We're so familiar with the story of Abraham and his guests, and then they, tell him about the destruction of Sodom and his famous speech attempting to intercede for Sodom. Then I think also more famous or well read and studied is the guests who come to Lot and the townspeople wanting to, bring them out, and Lot's defending them. And then we sort of pick up here in verse 12 with the guest saying, who's here? Take them out of this place because we're going to destroy this place because the outcry has become so great that God has sent us to destroy it. Right? This is kind of the parallel moment where it's not Abraham who's being told about the destruction of Sodom, but it's Lot who's being told from inside the city that this is going to happen. So he says, get out of here. They urge him away. Still, he delayed. The famous Vayit Mama with the shalshelet, a trup which is itself indicative of hesitation. So the men grab him and his wife and 2 daughters and bring him outside of the city. And I think kind of like, again, this may not be true for other people, the next handful of verses, until maybe we pick up again with Lot's wife looking back, and then the, events of Lot and his daughters, I kind of feel like often just get lost in the shuffle as like, okay, now the destruction of Sodom comes. But in light of Rav Bazak's essay, we're just going to take a slower look at it. He brought us through it, but let's take a slower look at it. So they say to him, they bring him outside of the city, and when they had brought him outside, also interesting parallel language actually to, I didn't notice this before, to what God does with Avram in last week's Parsha, Vayotzeo to hachutza. God takes Avram outside at a particular moment in the Parashah. Maybe there's something to this parallel as well. So once they brought him outside, one of them said, flee for your life, don't look back, go all the way away, because this whole region is going to be destroyed. Lot says, no, I can't make it all the way to the hills. I'll get kind of caught out, like, whatever the pace of the, kind of imagine a movie scene with like the fire and the flames are coming and people are trying to outrun them. He's saying, I can't outpace the kind of destruction, the wave of destruction. So let me just go to this place and let my life be saved. And the response is, very well, I will grant you this favor too. Hine nasati panecha gam ladavar hazeh, levilti hofkia ta'ir asher dibarta, and I'm not going to annihilate the town of which you have spoken, right? Which makes it sound, Lot asks for his own life, but what Rav Bazak is pointing out is that Lot seems to implicitly understand that wherever he goes, there's a chance that that place will be saved on his account. So he's saying, let my life be saved, but somehow he's also saying, and maybe that will save this town. And that seems to come to be true, because that's what the, Ish says to him. I won't annihilate this town of which you've spoken. So, flee there. And he goes there, and the town comes to be called Tzoar. He goes into Tzoar. God, rains down the destruction, annihilates everything. It seems like Tzoar is not destroyed. And then eventually Lot goes up from Tzoar because he doesn't want to stay there or is afraid to stay there anymore, which again, Rav Bazak points out to us seems to mean it's filled with evil people, but they were saved because Lot was there. And then they go out and they go to the cave, and the whole story of Lot and his daughters in the cave, picks up from there. And it seems like we're left to understand that, through his presence in Tzoar, he saves Tzoar. The wave of destruction skips over all other, kind of Pesach imagery. And there are some chazals about the connection of this, this period to Pesach. His presence seems to save Tzoar. And Rav Bazak really, suggests to us through the parallel that we're supposed to notice that Lot was actually successful in saving a town, and Avram wasn't. Now, there's a lot we can say, Avram maybe was trying to save too big a town, and Lot, set his sights on something smaller. Maybe it was all circumstantial, or coincidental. But I think to me, it was a fascinating take that drew me into that second half of the Sodom chapter and narrative more closely, and really made me question what are we being taught here, and how are we supposed to understand the importance of this little section and Lot's plea. And I think the Rav Bazak makes a compelling argument that whether it's explicitly intentional or not, Lot is really following in Avram's footsteps in his hospitality and in his attempt to save something of where he is, and that, again, intentionally or not, he's able to, in a way, be successful where Avram was. And I thought it was a fascinating insight. Also, this character of Lot, who's kind of almost, he has some agency, but in certain ways, his character is, intentional or not, drives a lot of the story, is kind of a way of telling the story of the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings, and Avram's involvement in it is just because of where Lot happens to be. That kind of kicks off. Avram hears that Lot is taken captive, and he gets involved in this whole big war. So kind of Lot as this character that drives a lot of plot movement, intentionally or unintentionally, I think is an interesting additional dimension that pops up here. Okay, pause for questions or reactions. And I think amongst the Rav Bazak essays, this one really, opened my eyes to something I wasn't paying much attention to before, by laying out the parallels of the first part of each of the chapters, and then it sort of, opens up the comparison in the second half. Steve, please go ahead and unmute.
if we agree that Lot is as righteous as Avraham, how do we understand his willingness to give up his daughters to the people who are asking for them instead of the men and the guests?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer to it. Um, it does. It feels like a hospitality which is all backwards from a, moral perspective, protecting the guests at the expense of one's own daughters. So it's a great question. If others have thoughts about it, absolutely jump in. Rabazak kind of just, doesn't address that here or in any of the essays in this chapter. So it's a very fair question. I don't have a great answer to it. I don't know whether it's, this is not I guess this is an apologetic, not a justification. Um, whether it reflects just something about the position of women or daughters, in that time. But it certainly doesn't explain or justify the action. So that's I'm glad you raised it. In the narrative itself, it requires addressing, but I don't have a good answer to the question. Other comments on this section? Okay, great. We'll keep going. Let me continue sharing my screen. Okay. Rainfall, fire, and brimstone. The Torah describes how the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulfurous fire from the Lord out of heaven. Afterward, we are told that God overturned those cities and the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation of the ground. If the cities were overturned and the fire and sulfurous rain were not significant, if the cities were overturned, the fire and sulfurous rain were not significant factors in their destruction. What exactly was this rain? Let's just look at those psukim so we can understand his question, which I think you might be able to answer a different way. But okay, yeah. So sun rose, Lot goes into Tzohar. Again, from the last comment, we see that kind of seems to protect Tzohar. And meanwhile, God rains down on Sodom and Amorah, Gofrit Va'esh, sulfurous fire from God out of heaven. Then, Vayahafoch et ha'arim ha'el ve'et kol ha'kikar. God annihilated or overturned is the literal translation that Rabazak is quoting. That is the more literal. And everyone who dwelt there and all the cities and the vegetation. Vayahafoch et ha'arim ha'el. So Rabazak seems to be reading these as two separate actions, the raining down of the sulfurous fire and then the overturning, which is, some type of massive destruction. And Rabazak is saying, if what God ultimately does in the second verse is vayahafoch, is overturn the whole thing, then why did God even need to bother to rain down the sulfurous fire? That was just sort of, trivial compared to the overturning. Now, one could, I think, just say that it's describing the same thing. The sulfurous fire was the destructive force, and it was through that God overtook it. It kind of a little bit different than the usual biblical narrative style, which is like a broad, a klalu prat, a broad comment, and then it gets specific, right? We might have expected it to say, Vayafoch et ha'arim ha'el, God, wiped out or overturned all those cities. How? By raining down Gofrit Va'esh. So maybe it's the fact that it's in the opposite order that provokes Rabazak to say, okay, so that was one thing, this specific raining down of fire and sulfur, and then there was the big destruction. So then what did you need the first? What did God need the first one for? That's his question. Again, I think you could read it in the Pshat sense that it's the same. That is the destruction. That's his question. What exactly was this rain? In Parshat Lech Lecha, we read about how Lot chose Sodom. Lot looked around and saw how well watered was the whole plain of the Jordan. This is again last week's Parsha where Abram and Lot come back from Egypt, and now they're getting ready to part ways. Avram tells him, figure out where you want to go, and I'll go the other direction. Rabbi Bracha spoke beautifully about this past Shabbat. And Lot looks around. Here's what he sees: how well watered was the whole plain of the Jordan, all of it. This was before God had destroyed Sodom and Amorah, all the way to Tzoar. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. What does it mean that the plain was well watered, and what does this have to do with Egypt? So we have to fast forward. The Torah explains the fundamental difference between water in Egypt and water in Israel. This is in Devarim Yud Aleph. For the land that you are about to enter and possess, land of Canaan, is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There, meaning the land of Egypt, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors, like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. It is a land which the Lord your God looks after, on which the Lord your God always keeps God's eye, from year's beginning to year's end. Okay, so now Rabbi Zak explains, Egypt enjoys a reliable source of water, that's the Nile, but it comes at the cost of not being under God's direct supervision. Israel needs God's mercy in the form of rain, and the Jews live in constant awareness of God's presence, right? So, Egypt is just, you got to carve out the pathways for the water to flow into the fields, and with the right labor, it can always work out, but it takes a lot of effort. Canaan is a land which there's nothing you can do. You got to pray and behave, and then God will rain down the rains. But you don't have to work in a manual labor sense, but you're also not in control of your destiny. It requires the divine intervention, so to speak, of rain. Lot chooses Sodom because the land there, like in Egypt, does not require rainwater, right? So looking back now, back in Lech Lecha, it says that Lot saw how well watered was the plain of the Jordan. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, meaning it was something which, naturally can be irrigated by the groundwater sources. Does not require rainwater. In so doing, he is expressing his wish to live a life disconnected from God in a society that has made the same choice. Rashi, following Chazal, explains the significance of Lot's choice. Lot traveled from the east, Kedem. He took himself from the predecessor, Kadmono, of the world, that is God, saying, I do not want Abraham or his God, right? So Rabbi Zak, quoting this Rashi, quoting Chazal, saying that Lot's choice to go where he went was a choice to kind of disconnect himself from God by going to a region which is not dependent on God, not dependent on rainwater, but can manage with the groundwater sources, and that was more than just like a convenience factor or agricultural choice. It was a spiritual choice to distance himself from God. Therefore, it is not surprising that Lot chose a society of very wicked sinners against the Lord. Sodom and Egypt were wicked places precisely because they were utterly cut off from God. Now, it's interesting, at one level we can say here, okay, Rabbi Zak's often the kind of entered into the homiletical realm. Certainly there's a little basis of connecting to, Midrashim here. But, when you look at the passage in Devarim that he's quoting, this point of the difference between groundwater and rainwater really is linked to a land where God's eye is and where that connection to God is present. So the Torah makes that connection, and he's just building on it and imputing that based on Chazal as a part of Lot's choice, which is not explicit in the Torah. Now we understand, okay, with all of that background, remember he had said at the beginning, what's this rain all about? We need to understand some background. So now we can come back and say, now we understand the symbolic punishment. Remember, for him, this is a symbolic punishment because the next pasuk after the raining down says God overturned the cities. That was the real destruction. So the raining down is something symbolic. Now we understand the symbolic punishment rained down upon Sodom, a society that lives disconnected from God, where the connection is normally expressed through rain, is punished with the unnatural, destructive rainfall of fire and sulfur, right? You try to avoid a rain-based agriculture that creates a connection with God. You can't. You'll get the rain, but it'll be a destructive rain. The people of Egypt would later be punished with unnatural, destructive precipitation of their own. The Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire streamed down to the ground, as the Lord rained down hail upon the land of Egypt. The hail was very heavy, fire flashing in the midst of the hail. Throughout the land of Egypt, the hail struck down. The Jews were also warned that if they sin, they too will be punished with unnatural precipitation. And in the Tochacha section, the admonition section in Parashat Kitavo, in the end of Varim, the Lord will make the rain of your land dust, and sand shall drop on you from the sky until you are wiped out. If, however, they walk in the ways of God, then the Lord will open for you God's bounteous store, the heavens, to provide rain for your land in season and to bless all your undertakings. Okay, so in this one, again, Reb Bazak seems to be driven on the face of it by a pshat question, which I think you could answer a different way, by why does it say that God rained down this sulfurous rain and then say God overturned the cities? I think it's possible to say that that's one and the same thing, but Reb Bazak thinks that they're two separate things, and therefore the raining down is somehow superfluous, and therefore symbolic, and he goes to seek that symbolism by noticing that Sodom has this connection with Egypt, that they are areas which are, nourished by their groundwater, and that was a choice that Lot explicitly made. Now, again, how can you criticize all the Sodomites for living there? They might have just been born there. They didn't necessarily choose that place and choose to depart from God in the way he and Chazal think that Lot does. So at some point, this argument may break down a little bit around, can we hold people responsible? But we could say, if this was the culture of this place disconnected, then maybe people should have gotten up and moved or something like that. I don't know. But he makes the connection between Sodom and Egypt as groundwater-based places where therefore there's a moving away from the connection with God. Lot chooses that, and the destruction of Sodom then includes this sort of symbolic punishing rain. We see that actually, for the continuity of the argument, he points out that we see that as a punishment in Egypt also in the plague of the hail, and the Bnei Israel are also warned of the very same thing, that their disconnecting from God will cause God to punish them with some kind of destructive type of rainfall. Okay, Racha, please go ahead and unmute.
Yeah. I was just wondering in Pasuk 24 why the Rachamim name of Hashem is used in relation to the destruction.
Let's see. It says Vadonai Yod-Heh Vav-Heh Himtir al Sodom. Yeah, you're saying maybe it would have been Elohim, which is Din, more likely. Yeah, great question. Again, I don't have a sense looking through the chapter. We don't have Yod-Heh Vav-Heh seems to be the name which is used in the couple of occurrences of God's name in the chapter. I don't know. Again, I think Kasuto is probably one of the main people who tries to analyze the appearances of God's name and how they function. I mean, it's a great question, which I don't have the answer to. Speculatively, maybe one could say that actually there was a dimension of mercy in, again, following Rav Bazak's train of thought, there was a dimension of mercy in Lot's being saved, in Tzoar being saved along with it. So even though fundamentally this was a just punishment, there were also dimensions of mercy in the destruction, and therefore that's the name that's used kind of for the whole chapter. You could argue maybe it should differentiate between the different moments in the chapter, but following that differentiation between God's names, maybe that's what's going on. I don't know. It's a great question.
Maybe part of it is that destroying ultimate evil is a chesed.
Yeah, that's another good way to look at it, that there's actually a rachamim, right? There's the famous comment of the sages that anybody who is mirachem al ha'achzarim, somebody who is compassionate to the cruel, sofo mitachzer al ha'merachamanim, something like that. Ultimately, winds up being cruel to those who are worthy of mercy. So there's definitely a complexity there, that compassion is not always the warranted response. So great. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on this one? Yeah, Steve, back to you. Go ahead, please. Go ahead and unmute.
Do we know why Lot initially being grateful to God for saving him, his family, and his community, then abandons God and Abraham and wants nothing to do with them?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the comment of Rav Bazak about the comment that Rav Bazak quotes about Lot kind of moving away from God, that's actually earlier than this section. So there's a little bit of inconsistency in Rav Bazak's reading. In the previous comment, he was really praising Lot for following through on Abraham's style of hospitality, even as he had gone to Sodom. But here he's quoting a comment of Rashi that Lot's choice to go to Sodom was actually a distancing himself from God. So they don't go well together. It's possible that we could say that, even though Lot wanted to move away from God, he still preserved the ethic of hospitality that, almost we sometimes differentiate, and actually in this parsha, there's a lot of teachings about this, about the differentiation between, mitzvot between man and God and mitzvot between man and fellow man. And, we might say that Lot's choice to move away, to Sodom was a rejection of his relationship with God. That part of Abraham's, legacy or values he didn't want, but he kept up the interpersonal values of hospitality. But it's a good question. This Lot functions in certain ways as kind of this test case of sort of the stickiness of Abraham's message. Are people who don't have it in them in the way that Abraham does, are they able to kind of hold on to it or not? And, depending on how you read Lot, you could say more so or less so. I see James's comment, maybe Lot was traumatized by the famine and saw Egyptian agriculture as more stable. Very, very good, plausible shot reading about his choice, which, doesn't have all these dimensions. Although I guess a Rav Bazak or Chazal would still say, okay, but he's supposed to believe, that God will provide even after a story of famine. I guess maybe this goes back to the comment of Rav Bazak we looked at last time about whether, staying in the land in a time of famine or going out of the land in the time of famine is the greater demonstration of kind of faith or trust. So maybe it relates to that as well. Okay. We're going to skip over one about Yishmael and Yitzchak and come to this one, Akedat Yitzchak, the double trial. Share my screen again. Okay. 3 times during the previous comment, talks about some of the parallels between chapter 21 and chapter 22, the what's sometimes called Akedat Yishmael and Akedat Yitzchak, the kind of not binding, but the dismissal or life-threatening situation of Yishmael and then of Yitzchak in the successive chapters. A lot is made about that. Those are, of course, the 2 Torah readings of Rosh Hashanah. So there's a lot, shared and taught about that. Now we come into the Akedah a little bit more singularly. 3 times during the story of the Akedah, we find the double expression, your son, your only son, bincha yechidcha, first as command, and then in the angel's declaration that Abraham has withstood the test, right? 2 times it's there, right? So first when God tells Abraham to sacrifice bincha yechidcha, your son, your only son, and then when the angel tells Abraham, stop and you've proven yourself, then twice in that instance, the angel says, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, lo chasachta bincha yechidecha. This expression illustrates the dual nature of this trial. Here, I just say as an aside, Rav Bazak is a wonderful reader of Pshat and of Chumash, as you see. He also is a great Talmud scholar and teacher. And while his approach to Gemara also is a little bit more a plain sense of the text, I think he's highly influenced by the Brisker school of Talmud study, which is a very central aspect of Talmud study in Yeshivat Har Etzion, where he teaches. And this, looking at two words side by side and suggesting that they kind of reflect two complementary or contradictory realities coexisting is a very kind of Brisker analysis type of approach. So you see a little carryover from their philosophy of Talmud study to the interpretation of Tanakh here. That's just my reading of what he's doing here, or a possible influence on what creates this reading. Obviously, it's a very common rabbinic approach to look at, a time where something seems superfluous or repetitive and differentiate, right? So it could have just said your son or your only son. Why does it need to say both? Teaching two different things. He's going to create for us sort of two frameworks. Okay, this expression illustrates the dual nature of this trial. First is the obvious trial, the act of asking a man to offer up his son. There is no greater act of belief and obedience. There is, however, an additional meaning. The episode begins sometime afterward. After which previous events? All right, so just skip forward. Vahi achar hadvarim ha'eleh v'ha'elohim nisat Avraham, beginning of chapter 22. Sometime afterward is the kind of colloquial translation that JPS provides, but Rabbi Zak is reading it more literally. After these things. Well, which things? Well, it came right after the story of Yishmael and Avraham, Hagar and Ishmael. So after which previous events, given the strong linguistic parallels between this story and that of the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, which we just discussed, that was in the previous comment that we didn't get to look at, let us assume that this is the episode to which the text refers, meaning after the story of Hagar and Ishmael, that's what this is following on the heels of, that God then tests Abraham and asks him to sacrifice his only son, his only son, right? In this case, the trial of the Akedah is that much more difficult. The justification for kicking Yishmael out of the family home is that Kivi Yitzchak yikareh lechazara. It's through Yitzchak that offspring shall be continued for you, right? When Abraham is hesitant to kick out Yishmael, God says, you need to do it, and don't fear. This isn't necessarily why Abraham was fearing doing it, but don't fear that in kicking out Ishmael, you're ending your continuity, because you are going to have continuity through Yitzchak. How can that happen, continuity through Yitzchak, if Abraham now has to sacrifice Yitzchak? Right, so this is sort of what Rabbi Zak is kind of pointing out as the second dimension. There's the narrower frame, which is being asked to sacrifice your son. And then there's the broader context, which is this seems to then spell the end of any future for Abraham. Moreover, the phrase "get yourself," lech lecha el eretz haMoriah, right? Go forth to the land of Moriah, where the Akedah was to take place. That was at the very beginning of chapter 22. And the second verse, take your son, your only son, v'lech lecha el eretz haMoriah, and get yourself, go to the land of the Moriah. Clearly echoes the earlier use of the phrase, lech lecha, famously, when Abraham is first commanded to leave home, beginning of last week's Parsha. Aside from the unique phrase, both commands are tripartite. The Akedah is prefaced with, take your son, your only one, Yitzchak, whom you love. Sounds a little bit quadripartite, but okay. Each noun is prefaced with the emphatic et. Similarly, Abraham's first command is to leave me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha u'mibeit avicha, from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house. Okay, so there each noun is prefaced with a me, but there's this sort of staccato feel of the three parts, and each with their own introductory preposition or particle. In both stories, the destination is unknown. First, Abraham is directed to the land that I will show you, and later he's told to sacrifice Yitzchak on one of the mountains that I will point out to you. This approach only sharpens the fundamental distinction between the two tests. meaning the test of Lech Lecha in the beginning of chapter 12, and now the test of this Akedah in particular, with the broader frame that is, the sacrifice of his only remaining son, so to speak. That's the fundamental distinction between the two tests. In the first, Lech Lecha, he was asked to relinquish his past, though with the promise of a bright future, right? Go, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curse you. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. Okay, so that is the first test, the Lech Lecha, which was relinquishing the past with the promise of a bright future. The Akedah asks Abraham to relinquish his future and all that was promised. He will be left with no past and no future, right? And I think it's an important thing to remember about Abraham, that if he doesn't have progeny, it's not just that the promise of being the progenitor of a great nation is gone, or his family future, evaporates before his eyes, but depending on what you make of kind of Avram bringing people under the, wings of monotheism, and how literally we take that and how impactful we understand that to be, Abraham had left his home. So he was without his past now, and then now being, tested to whether he would be willing to relinquish his future. Abraham's greatness in the Akedah is not just in his heroic willingness to sacrifice his beloved son, but also in his supreme belief. Although the command negates the promise God has made, Abraham acts with utter faith. Only at the last minute is the contradiction resolved, and the angel can say unequivocally, "Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son," that's the narrower frame, "your only one," that's the broader future frame, "from me." Thoughts or comments? Again, this one I think falls more into kind of the classical analysis. Like, again, no great chidush here. We understand that Abraham is an individual with his family, and also the progenitor of a nation and part of this big covenantal moment, and that both of those things are at play. But through Rebbe Zak, I think, has made a couple of points. He's embedded that in the text through noticing these two terms, bincha yechidcha, and then also situated it through the parallel between this kind of final test and the first test, helping us recognize the kind of bookends for Abraham of leaving his past, and now the test of whether he's willing to terminate his own future. Bracha, and then Lance, go ahead.
I'm back with the names of God again.
Okay, good. I gotta open up a Kasuto before next week.
It's like really drawing me. So in Pasuk 12, it says, Ata yadati ki yirei Elokim ata. Abraham is being appreciated for being a Yirei Elokim, which is the justice name of God. But then, as a result of that experience, in Pasuk 14, it says, Vayikra Abraham Shem Hamakom Hahu Hashem Yireh. Yeah. So it's yeah. almost like Hashem was recognizing where Abraham's strengths were, but that maybe he had not yet gotten to the chesed point of Hashem's name in this situation until after he went through that.
Yeah, very nice.
But then he himself recognizes that and calls the place Hashem Yireh. You would think he would call it Elokim Yireh based on the previous passage.
Great. Thank you. Good insight. Again, I'll see if I can find anything from Kasuto on these sections, just to see if he does address it directly in any way. Lance, go ahead. Great to hear you.
Is God testing or torturing? Is God benevolent, or is God a sadistic sociopath? And if you look at the whole
Cue the Leonard Cohen line.
exactly. If you are the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, I'm broken and lame. Right? And Rabbi Sachs, I don't know if you've seen it, has a very interesting video where he's in a hotel room somewhere, and he's discussing You Want It Darker, where the video where I think is Leonard Cohen's last video, and he really struggles to come out with something positive about that video. I don't think there is anything positive about that video. I don't think there's anything positive right now. If you look around the world, what's going on, people are being tortured left and right, killed, maimed, tortured, burned, and mentally tortured, as a number of people in this country who somehow got on the wrong side of the election and they're not feeling very well.
I'll leave that last piece, and thank you as always. Yeah, look, the Akedah is incredibly tough, and Reb Bazak here, just kind of takes the party line of, it's a test of faith. Avram passes the test by his absolute willingness to do it. And I think that's the approach that I find, I don't know what the right word is, tolerable, is the sort of understanding that it really was, as the plain sense is, a test. God never intended to actually follow through. And so it's a subtle, nuanced, and tricky sort of message. The message is God would want us to be willing to do it, but would never actually ask us to do it when it comes to sacrificing a son. But that's a hard. Why would God ask of us a loyalty that God would never actually ask us to follow through on? If God would never actually expect us to follow through on it, because to actually do it would be immoral, then why is a test of our faith to show that we would be willing to do a thing that God would never ask us to do because it's immoral? So it's as I would say, every single question tonight, the questions are all better than the answers. So thank you for raising them. I think we'll pause here. Let's do a quick moment of summary. We got to 3 of the essays. The first one kind of parallels between Lot and Abraham's hospitalities, and yet when each of them was presented with the destruction of Sodom, Abraham intervenes but doesn't succeed, stops at a certain point. Lot manages to succeed with some saving, the saving of Zoar, and that's because he's sort of an insider. And again, I think the parallels that are generated there and the way it draws our attention to the second half of that story in chapter 19 were kind of the key takeaways for me, because that part of the story I so often just gloss over. The second essay was our look at, in Reb Bazak's reading, that the destruction of Sodom, being described as the raining down of the sulfurous fire, was superfluous, because the next verse describes the decisive destruction. I think that those might be the same thing. Haven't checked the commentaries, but Reb Bazak thinks that they're separate, and that makes the first destruction, the raining down of the sulfurous fire, to be superfluous. What's its point? It's there to kind of continue or introduce a narrative about the choice of Sodom and Egypt as being, because those are places which are groundwater nourished. It's sort of a movement towards them, as a movement away from a relationship with God. And when you do that, then you get punished with when you avoid a rainfall-based relationship, you get punished with destructive rain. That happens in Egypt too, and that happens that's a threat to Bnei Israel as well if they don't obey the mitzvot. And then we moved forward towards the end of the Parsha, Takedat Yitzchak, and to the noticing of the kind of 2 simultaneous trials for Abraham, the just interpersonal one of the sacrifice of his son, and the broader covenantal, national one, that he was now being asked, having already left his past, he was now being asked also to terminate his future, and he was willing to do that. Ultimately that was his sign of success or faith. And got to do some looking up about names of God for next time, I hope. So thanks to everybody. Great to learn together. Always welcome your comments offline, even if you don't comment online. And glad mom and dad were able to listen in. Lots of love. Good night to all.